Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second half of Lecture 4, where we get into circulation in the deep ocean and talk a little bit about climate research in Antarctica. And that will bridge us into talking more about Earth science next week, where I begin to give you some context as to the geology of Antarctica, and that will lead into a discussion of Antarctica's history, or Antarctica's geologic history, which will give us some context as to how Antarctica arrived at the climate that it has today. Now, so far, when we've talked about ocean circulation, we've talked about circulation at the surface, largely driven by wind and by the Coriolis effect, creating the deflection known as Ekman transport. Something I mentioned before, though, is that we have a separate pattern of circulation that occurs from the surface of the ocean to the lower layers, and it has a lot to do with density. I mentioned differences in density, or how much mass there is per unit volume, and density differences are the main driver in what is known as thermohaline circulation, which is the very slow movement of water throughout the vertical water column of the ocean, and that water goes from the surface to below and eventually back again. And this occurs throughout the world. The water spends much of its time traveling under the ocean, traveling in the deep parts of the ocean. In ocean water, density is largely driven by two factors: how warm the water is and how salty the water is. Why is that relevant to Antarctica? Because two things happen at the poles that are important. Water loses heat to the cold air, with the water becoming colder itself, and sea ice formation occurs. And sea ice formation causes certain masses of water to become saltier, and this allows water to sink. And the poles are, in fact, where much of the sinking in the overall pattern of thermohaline circulation occurs. And thermohaline circulation is the general term for the global conveyor belt. And notice that the sinking isn't happening everywhere. The sinking largely happens in the North Atlantic as well as in the area around Antarctica. And in part because you don't have as much of open water in the Arctic. There are some places in the Arctic where actually the sea ice formation doesn't actually cause the water to become salty enough, and it stays too fresh. In the North Pacific, it turns out not actually much of this process occurs. This can be very slow, by the way. This can occur on the scale of hundreds or even thousands of years. Now, the colder and saltier that liquid water gets, the denser it gets. Until water forms ice, water will become more compact as its molecules move around less and less. And the presence of salt in the water also will mean that there is more mass per unit area. You don't really think of the salt as having mass when it's just dissolved there, but there are ions present that take up mass. And if there's more stuff dissolved in the water, like salt, it is going to be more dense. And you have to consider this separately from the fact that ice, or solid water, is less dense than liquid water, regardless of whether that liquid water is hot or cold. And this ice being less dense than liquid water is a consequence of water molecules being polar. Water molecules being polar means that the oxygen atom in a water molecule has what's known as a partially negative charge, since oxygen in general attracts electrons to it. And in contrast, the hydrogen atoms have a partially positive charge. Now, in liquid form in water, the hydrogen bonds, which are the weak bonds between the partially positive hydrogen of one water molecule and the partially negative oxygen bonds of a separate water molecule, those bonds tend to be very weak and tend to be very fleeting. They tend to last only a few seconds because in a liquid, the molecules are moving around a lot more. But when water becomes a solid, the individual water molecules cease to move around quite as much. The hydrogen bonds stabilize, and as you can see in the diagram on the lower left, they form a hexagonal pattern that forms in order to maximize the separation between the oxygen atoms of two separate water molecules. And this causes ice to be more opened up and less dense than liquid water. And it's actually very uncommon for the solid form of any substance to be less dense than its liquid form, and it is an interesting consequence of the polarity of water molecules. That is why sea ice floats. And it's just interesting to me that the abundance of liquid water on Earth is that water is a really unique substance in a lot of ways. Its particular polarity leads it to have some properties that allow certain phenomena to exist, like the formation of sea ice floating on the ocean surface. But remember that water gets denser as it gets colder until it becomes a solid. That's kind of the main point of this distinction here. Now, when we return to mostly thinking about liquid water, the oceans, like the atmosphere, are going to be stratified or separated into layers by salinity and temperature, and overall, thus, their density. The water at the surface, especially at the equator, is going to be saltier because the sun evaporates water and takes it away in the form of water vapor. The salt does not go with the gaseous water vapor. It stays behind in the remaining ocean water. So you have the same amount of salt in a smaller amount of liquid water, and that leaves the remaining surface ocean water noticeably saltier. This decreases as you go down because sunlight doesn't actually penetrate that far into the ocean, and the term the halocline refers to the boundary at which the sun no longer has this influence, and that creates a density separation based on salinity that normally masses of water cannot easily cross. The fact that the sun heats the water only very effectively at the surface means the surface water is a lot warmer than the deep water. If you dive, you notice that the water gets cold very quickly. You can swim down far enough that you notice the sunlight not reaching the lower layers much. And so this produces a boundary known as the thermocline, where you have a temperature difference. Now, if you combine the thermocline and the halocline together, factoring them, you get a density separation. You get the pycnocline because density is dependent on salinity, how salty the ocean is, and temperature largely. And so generally there is very little interchange between surface ocean water and deep ocean water. Something different happens at the poles though. For one thing, the sun is weaker and solar radiation heats the surface of the ocean much less effectively. Remember that the sunlight is much more spread out at the poles and it will be providing energy less effectively. So this means that the temperature of the surface water at the poles is actually not that much higher than the water that's deeper down at the poles. Furthermore, the poles frequently experience infusions of meltwater from glaciers calving or breaking up, as well as sea ice periodically melting. And also, again, the solar radiation doesn't effectively cause evaporation. There's not only more periodic influxes of fresh water from melting glaciers or melting sea ice, but you also don't have as much evaporation. So in general, the surface water, I apologize for that. I thought I took that slide out. In general, the surface water is going to be less salty. And so you have a less pronounced halocline at the poles. And this is even during the summer. Solar radiation doesn't effectively either heat the water or cause evaporation during the summer. So this produces a less pronounced density boundary between the surface and deep water at the poles, allowing, fundamentally, more mixing to occur. And one thing I want you to consider is that going forward, I'll be talking about how certain masses of water can get more salty from sea ice formation. But overall, the Antarctic surface waters are less salty than those at the equator, and they're about as salty as the deep water at the poles. There's less of a prominent density difference, so if a mass of water does get noticeably colder and saltier than the surrounding water, it's able to sink right to the bottom because of the weakened pycnocline. The pycnocline, or the density separation, would normally stop that mass of water from being able to simply sink down. And the water that forms in that way is known as Antarctic bottom water. It's made largely in coastal polynyas, or openings that we'll talk more about, in the Weddell and Ross Seas, but areas of Antarctic bottom water formation do occur all around Antarctica. And the water can be detected spreading out on the bottom of the ocean as far north as 50 degrees, simply because there's so much of it. It is extremely salty and cold. It is also going to be full of nutrients from the surface, in particular because during the Antarctic winter, relatively little biological activity occurs. And this leaves large amounts of the nutrients that are floating around in the water untapped, and they get distributed to the deep ocean and thus spread elsewhere throughout the world. And this is one reason why deep ocean circulation is so important. It helps recycle nutrients from the surface down to the bottom of the ocean and eventually distributes them much more broadly to the world's oceans. And it also brings oxygen. The water has been in contact with the surface and is thus much better oxygenated than deep water would normally be. And in Antarctica, remember, the picnic line is not very pronounced, and the density differences between the surface and the deep are not all that noticeable. In Antarctica, water that is already very cold and pretty dense can rapidly become much more dense as a result of sea ice formation. When sea ice forms, just as salt doesn't really go in the gaseous water when evaporation occurs, it also doesn't go into ice when you get solid ice. Oh, this little lady sat on the keyboard. The ice doesn't take up any of the salt. The salt stays in whatever liquid water is behind. Since if you think about it, you're never going to freeze the whole ocean. When sea ice forms, only some of the liquid water is turning into solid water. There's still a lot of liquid water left over, but there's less than there was before any sea ice formed, and there is the same amount of salt that was present in that lessened, smaller remaining amount of liquid water. So the remaining liquid water is now salty, and thus it's denser than the surrounding surface water. With the picnic line not being as pronounced, this individual mass of colder, saltier water can simply sink down, and it does, and then spreads out away from Antarctica. As it goes away from Antarctica, though, it can't necessarily rise to the surface again, even as it becomes less dense, because it will become less salty as it mixes with not particularly salty deep ocean water. And this is because that as you get away from the poles and closer to the equator, the picnic line does become more pronounced. And that causes the water to simply instead spread out over the bottom of the ocean, distributing nutrients and oxygen as it does. And a lot of this, again, is related to sea ice formation. In Antarctica, you have water that is already very cold, becoming much more dense as sea ice formation extracts water while leaving salt behind. When sea ice forms, the salt does not go into the ice. It stays in the water that remains liquid, and that remaining liquid water is now salty and denser than the surrounding surface water. And I want to say, don't get confused with the fact that I mentioned that Antarctic surface waters are overall fairly fresh and about as fresh as the deep water. That is indeed true. With water masses, you have to think about them as being something of an isolated occurrence. And indeed, Antarctic bottom water formation zones are sort of like, they're very small concentrated zones of a few miles in some cases. You have a relatively small mass of water forming, small compared to the overall body of water present. And in the individual areas, you have sea ice formation rendering the individual masses of water saltier than the surrounding relatively fresh polar waters, and that's what causes it to sink. And it can sink because the reason it can sink actually is because both the vast majority of the surface water and the vast majority of the deep water are fairly fresh. There's not much of a density separation between the two. And when a small amount of water, a small mass of water, does become much more salty and denser than everything, both denser than most of the surface water and even denser than most of the deep water, it can just plunge straight down. There's not a density separation that inhibits that. But when you consider the role of sea ice, it is important to consider that one reason why overall Antarctic surface waters are somewhat fresher is because you get sea ice coming and going seasonally, and you get some break-off of, you get a significant amount of freshwater influx from the icebergs that are coming off of the ice sheets, aka the extensions of the glaciers in Antarctica. And I'm simplifying quite a bit. One thing I'll touch on later in this lecture is that there's a lot that needs to go right for Antarctic bottom water to be forming. You need a coastline that's the right shape. You need a strong enough wind to be pushing the sea ice away. And you need to get consistent enough sea ice formation. And an interesting occurrence in Antarctica is the role that these Catabolic winds, or the pressure winds that I alluded to earlier, play in everything. Now, the strong winds from the interior, the Catabolic winds, literally push ice away from the shore, and this exposes liquid seawater. And the surface of the newly exposed seawater rapidly freezes due to the fact that it's exposed to the air, which is really cold, and it forms new sea ice. This causes the remaining liquid water to become saltier, and it sinks as Antarctic bottom water. The winds will keep blowing, though, and it'll over time push the newly formed sea ice away, and that will cause more surface water to be exposed to the air, and that will cause new sea ice formation, and that will cause another round of Antarctic bottom water masses sinking down. So it's a cycle. You need a steady flow of catabolic winds with the right shaped coastline produces a steady pattern of a little bit of sea ice forming and then being pushed and causing Antarctic bottom water formation, and then that sea ice being pushed away and more surface water is exposed, and then the cycle starts all over. And in this picture, you can see how there's a bit of a gap between the ice shelf and the sea ice itself, and that is a coastal polynya. A polynya is basically a fancy word for gap. And the formation of these polynyas is crucial for Antarctic bottom water to form. Now, Antarctic bottom water is probably the most important water mass that has to do with Antarctica, but it's not the only one. Notice here how there's several different masses involved. You have Antarctic bottom water sinking to just about the bottom of the ocean. And interestingly enough, you have another water mass, North Atlantic deep water, which forms from similar processes in the North Atlantic, actually traveling as far south as Antarctic, traveling far south, and being observed actually in some cases as far south as Antarctica. And you want to note that, again, the movement of water underneath is driven by different processes than the movement of water at the surface. Deep water circulation has very little to do with wind. And deep water circulation is going to be driven by density differences. And you'll see this manifested in at what levels of the ocean different water masses are present. North Atlantic deep water tends to not be quite as cold and salty as Antarctic bottom water. And also, by the time it comes anywhere near Antarctic bottom water, it's also usually mixed a little bit with other surrounding masses of water. And so it will flow over the Antarctic bottom water because the Antarctic bottom water is especially dense. You'll notice up here that there's a couple of other masses, such as Antarctic surface water. And in this diagram, the Antarctic surface water actually sinks and becomes another water mass known as Antarctic intermediate water at the polar front, aka the Antarctic convergence that we've learned about before. So another one of this distinct masses is the Antarctic intermediate water that I just mentioned. It forms as surface water flowing away from Antarctica sinks at the Antarctic convergence because it goes under less dense, warmer waters from the north. It will then travel underneath the surface waters as far north as 20 degrees. And it's not quite as voluminous overall as Antarctic bottom water. It does still serve a role in spreading oxygen and nutrients throughout the deep ocean. It just doesn't sink nearly as deep as Antarctic water because it's not as cold and dense. It was water that was moving along the surface until it ran into another mass of water and underwent what we know as downwelling. And upwelling and downwelling are terms that will show up in your lab next week. Masses of water, just as traffic can, they can either come together or head in different directions. And when two masses of water converge, you get what's known as a front or a convergence, like the Antarctic convergence. Meanwhile, divergence of two water masses will produce upwelling. And divergence can occur when either water is pushed away from the coast by winds, which actually produces the coastal polynyas that we were talking about before. Some of what's happening as part of the process at the coast is that there's upwelling occurring. Water gets brought to the surface, and then chilled immediately by the air. You can also have two masses of water moving in different directions farther from the coast, and this will also cause upwelling. It'll cause water to replace the water that's being moved to either side. And we can actually get another type of polynya, or an open water polynya, out in the ocean if you have two masses of water that are away from the coast moving in opposite directions. And what happens in either a coastal or open water polynya is that warm water that has not been exposed to the air rises up to take the place of water that's moving away. And this leaves, at least temporarily, a spot of open water out on the sea ice. You get downwelling in fronts, and meanwhile, if you instead have two masses coming together, and that is what pushes the Antarctic intermediate water down. The more dense mass of water will be forced down and spread out deeply in the ocean. Now, one of the articles I assigned, article number 2, talks about one of the sites of Antarctic bottom water formation, the Weddell Sea. And what's happening in the Weddell Sea is that a study that's been occurring over the course of 30 years or so has detected the water that is below 2,000 meters warming much faster than the surface water. And the conclusion they came to is that this has to do with changing wind and surface current patterns in the Southern Ocean, bringing more heat further south, because movement of water brings heat, remember. And as a result of climate change, we have more heat being trapped in Earth's system, and thus more of that is being brought to Antarctica, even if we're not necessarily noticing that just as humans standing at the surface. Really, what's happened is that, according to this article, the westerly winds, as well as the Antarctic circumpolar current as a whole, have shifted a few degrees to the south, and they've also intensified because of increased energy. Increased energy causes wind and water to move faster. So ultimately, more heat is being transferred to the Weddell Sea than when the scientists first started making their measurements 30 years ago. And this warmer water has the potential to weaken the formation of Antarctic bottom water. It's warmer and less dense, so it has the potential to rise and disrupt the formation process. And in general, Antarctic bottom water forms under rather delicate circumstances. You must have a coastline that's shaped correctly for sea ice to be pushed away at the right rate. You need to have a deep basin nearby in which the Antarctic bottom water can sink. And you also have to have a consistent supply of catabolic winds forming polynyas. And it's not yet clear precisely how the deep sea warming is going to play out regarding bottom water formation, but it does indicate that with global warming, circulation patterns that we took for granted are rapidly changing. And one thing I liked about this article is that it draws a connection between a deep water circulation pattern and a surface circulation pattern. It's not going to be completely accurate if I say that the two have nothing to do with one another. In general, they operate on different levels and don't interact that much. But with global warming, something that happens to one Earth system is likely to have consequences in another system, and it's not something that we can always be aware of, at least on the level that our senses can pick up. We can notice temperature, we can notice the air temperature getting warmer, we can notice the seasons changing, and with scientific studies, we can also notice that the deep water is changing temperature and try to figure out why. One of the other things I assigned you was the clip of Frozen Planet, which is from the introductory episode to a series of TV episodes that the BBC made highlighting different aspects of life in the Arctic and Antarctic, both the wildlife and climate, as well as the human history. And if you watched more of this Frozen Planet episode, like if you started from the beginning, you'll realize a lot of it is dedicated to the Arctic and talks a fair bit about the people who live in the Arctic, because there is much more habitable land close to the Arctic, and there's been an indigenous population there for a long time. In the shorter Antarctic segment, for one thing, it's just fun to see all of the shots of the Antarctic wilderness and the Southern Lights, but it also does a nice job of illustrating the human history. And I've put some takeaway points here to add on to some of the discussion questions for the movie that I put in one of the slides for lecture 3 early on, as well as in the slides that I put out for the review session I had on this last Monday. And this clip gives you a sense of some themes that we'll come back to, including that the human history of Antarctic exploration is quite short. We've only fully known that Antarctica existed for a few centuries. It also does a good job of illustrating just how dark it is during the polar winter and how people have to adapt to that. And humans are animals, and we've had to adapt to have any chance of surviving in Antarctica by building shelters that keep the wind and the cold out, by adapting to wearing clothing that keeps us warm, by developing safety protocols to keep people safe during the winter, by generating our own light, both to be able to see and also in some cases actually being able to using human generated light to be able to grow food in greenhouses. And it's interesting to think about how humans have also had to adapt. Other animals like orca whales have adapted by, say, developing subcutaneous fat, blubber that keeps them warm while they're swimming. Penguins, as we'll get to later in the term, have adapted a lot of their bodies in ways to survive in Antarctica. And humans haven't been in Antarctica long enough for our physical bodies to necessarily change that much. We don't really have a permanent population there, but we've still had to adapt how we build there and how we go about our business there in order to survive. Now, something we'll talk about in the coming weeks is that the continents move, and the location of the continents has played a long-term role in Antarctica's climate. Antarctica has been close to the South Pole for quite a while, but it's not always been there, and it's also not, Antarctica hasn't always been as cold even when it's been fairly close to the South Pole. And part of that is that Antarctica has been attached to other continents until quite recently, such as in this diagram from 95 million years ago in the age of dinosaurs, when you see that Antarctica had an intermittent connection with South America and was still firmly attached to Australia and the lost continent of Zealandia, which is actually a massive continent that today is only exposed really in New Zealand and New Caledonia and otherwise is visible as the sunken plateau. And during much of what we consider the dinosaur age, there were no ice sheets in Antarctica, even though Antarctica was still sitting over the South Pole. There was no Antarctic circumpolar current surrounding the continent, and even though Antarctica still experienced relatively little sunlight and a dark polar winter, you had no ice cap. And with no ice cap, you didn't have catabolic winds, as well as you didn't have the high albedo that you have from Antarctica today. And we'll set aside the fact as to how scientists have figured out where the continents to be until later. But how do we find out about past Antarctic climates? How do we get clues as to what the climate of Antarctica has actually been like? And something we'll return to when we talk about climate change is that our understanding of what the climate is today is really enhanced by paleoclimatology, which is the study of remnants of the past to make educated guesses about the climate of the world from when we were able to get those remnants. We usually have to make an educated guess based on proxies like the presence of trees in the fossil record or patterns in the isotopes that we obtain from carbonates we get from seafloor mud samples, which is one thing they were doing in the article I had you read. And we can, for example, use varves, which are the patterns of sediment produced by glaciers that we'll talk more about. And we can see, for example, if more or less sediment is being produced, and that can tell us whether glaciers are getting larger or smaller. We can drill into the ocean floor to look at fossils of tiny plankton whose abundance and variety is linked to climate, and we can also look at isotope ratios in the carbonate found in these mud samples. Not as much in Antarctica, but something you can do elsewhere in the world and then correlate with studies from Antarctica is look at the cave formations, especially the isotope ratios in the carbonates making up these cave formations. And you can use tree rings, which is not easy to do in Antarctica today because we don't have any living trees there. But it's possible to correlate tree rings from trees grown elsewhere in the world with patterns in ice cores in Antarctica. And in Antarctica, we actually have the ability to drill into the glaciers and obtain air bubbles from inside the ice cores taken from those glaciers in order to figure out what the chemistry of the past air was like. We can find carbon dioxide concentrations, for example, and since carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, has concentrations that are very heavily linked to how warm the world is overall, the CO2 concentrations in ice cores can serve as a proxy for global temperature, and we can also see how we can also figure out how old the air bubbles at different depths of the ice are and correlate changes in CO2 concentration with changes in tree growth rings or changes in cave formations elsewhere in the world. And we can also, on a very long scale, look at fossils to get a sense of whether Antarctica could support plants and forests and more complex life than it presently does in the past. The answer, as it turns out, is yes, and that will occupy a lot of the lecture material in the coming weeks. Next week, we'll learn about plate tectonics and rocks and dive into the Earth history of Antarctica after that. We'll temporarily be setting aside the concept of Antarctica as a frozen wasteland because geologically it not always has been, but long-term, the upcoming lectures will give you more of a sense as to how we got to this point. So I'll see you next week. There'll be a review session on Monday before the quiz, and look forward to getting some geology because it's not the best thing for me to say that something is my favorite part, but I really do enjoy teaching about the Earth history of Antarctica. It also makes the dinosaur girl inside of me very happy. So until then.